Get out of my courtroom. I don't care who you think you are." That was the last thing Leonard Hatch said to her before the gavel came down. 3 hours later, he was on his knees in the parking lot of the Whitmore Club, begging her not to make a single phone call. She made it anyway. She always had. The annual Whitmore Club Founders Dinner happened every October, and in Charleston, it was the kind of event that required a waiting list just to be considered for a waiting list. 600 members, private dining rooms that smelled like old leather and older money, and a coat check staffed by college kids who had been told, very clearly, that the members preferred not to be kept waiting. Audra Voss arrived in a 10-year-old navy blazer and flat shoes she'd owned since her 40s. No jewelry except the small gold stud earrings her mother had given her when she passed the bar. Her hair was clipped back with the kind of plastic clip you found in a drugstore. She carried no handbag worth mentioning. She had been a member of the Whitmore Club for 11 years. She was also, though no one in that room had thought to look, one of the most powerful federal judges on the eastern seaboard. The valet who took her car was 19 years old and clearly having a bad night. His hands shook slightly as he took her keys, and when she stepped out onto the cobblestone drive, the wind off the harbor caught the door and nearly ripped it from his grip. "I've got it," Audra said, and she caught the door herself. "Breathe. These things happen." The kid looked at her like she'd handed him a lifeline. "Thank you, ma'am. I'm sorry. Don't be. It's cold out here. Do they have you out here all night?" "Yes, ma'am." She pressed 2 folded bills into his hand and walked toward the entrance. She didn't look back to watch his reaction. She never did. That wasn't why she did it. Inside, the founders' dinner was already in full swing. Crystal chandeliers threw warm light across 200 people in black tie, all of them holding glasses they refilled too often and speaking too loudly about things that mattered very little. Audra moved through the room the way she always did at these things, slowly, without announcing herself, watching. She'd spent 30 years watching. At the bar, she found her daughter standing alone in a way that was trying very hard not to look like standing alone. Celia was 29, tall like her father, and nervous like him too when she didn't want to be. She had married into this world 8 months ago, married Julian Hatch, the youngest son of Leonard Hatch, which meant she now spent a significant portion of her life in rooms where people measured her. "You made it," Celia said, and her voice had the slightly clipped quality of someone keeping a great deal below the surface. "I said I would." Audra touched her daughter's arm. "You okay?" "I'm fine. Julian's with his father somewhere." She glanced toward the far end of the room. "Leonard has been Leonard tonight." Audra followed her gaze to where Leonard Hatch held court near the fireplace. He was a wide man, well-fed in the particular way of men who have never worried about a bill, with silver hair swept back from a face that had been handsome 20 years ago and knew it. He was laughing at something someone had said, and the laugh was too big, too certain, the laugh of a man who had never once sat in a room and wondered if he belonged. He was also, Audra knew, the most successful commercial real estate developer in 3 states. He sat on 4 boards. He had twice been photographed shaking hands with the governor. He had never in his life been told no by anyone who wasn't immediately overruled. He had not wanted his son to marry Celia. He had said so, at the engagement dinner, in language that stopped just short of being something a lawyer could use. Celia had sat through it with her jaw tight and her hands folded in her lap, the way Audra had taught her, and afterward had cried in the car for 40 minutes. Audra had listened. She had not told her daughter what she knew. She had simply held her hand and waited for the right moment. That moment, it turned out, had not yet arrived. It arrived in October. "He's been watching me all night," Celia said quietly. "Like I'm going to steal something." "Let him watch," Audra said. "Is there a table for us?" "We're seated with the Hatches." "Good." Celia looked at her sideways. "You always say that like you know something I don't." "I usually do," Audra said, and smiled at the bartender, who filled her water glass without being asked. The dinner tables were long and covered in white cloth, set with the kind of silverware that requires a particular upbringing to navigate without thinking. Audra sat down and unfolded her napkin and nodded pleasantly to the people around her, none of whom she recognized. The seat to her left remained empty. The seat to Julian's right was Leonard Hatch himself, and he had not yet sat down. He was still by the fireplace, still holding court, still performing. A woman Audra didn't know leaned across the table. She was in her 60s, wearing something that had cost more than a semester of community college, and she looked at Audra's blazer with an expression she'd taken care not to make legible. "Are you a friend of the family?" she asked. "I'm Celia's mother," Audra said. "Oh," the woman processed this. "And what do you do?" "I work in law, a paralegal." The woman seemed pleased to have placed her. "Something like that," Audra said, and reached for her water. Celia pressed her foot very slightly against Audra's under the table. Audra didn't react. Leonard arrived at the table like an event. He pulled out his chair with a scrape that was just loud enough to turn heads, greeted the people he recognized with the warm, self-congratulatory ease of a man in his native territory, and did not acknowledge Audra until he'd already sat down. "You're Celia's mother," he said then. "Not a question." "That's right." Audra extended her hand. "Audra Voss." Leonard shook it briefly. "Leonard Hatch." He said it the way a man says his own name when he expects it to produce a reaction. "Julian tells me you're in law?" "I am." "Firm?" "Federal." He nodded with the polite disinterest of a man who had decided he already knew everything about her. His wife, Constance, sat on his other side, fine-boned and faintly apologetic in the particular way of women who had spent decades softening their husbands' edges. She gave Audra a small, genuine smile. Audra returned it. The soup came. The conversation moved around the table like water finding its level. Audra ate quietly and listened, which is what she always did in rooms like this. You learned more by listening than you ever did by talking. She had built her entire professional life on that principle. Leonard, across from her, learned nothing. He had turned his full attention to the man on his right, a developer from Greenville, who was deeply interested in a parcel of land near the port. They talked the way men talk when they sense a deal in the air, circling, measuring, performing casualness. Audra caught pieces of it without trying. The project, the rezoning, the commissioner who was making difficulties. She set down her spoon very slightly at that last part. The main course arrived, the wine was refilled, and then, during a pause in the table's conversation, Leonard turned to look at Celia directly for the first time all evening. "You changed your hair," he said. "I did," Celia said pleasantly. "Julian didn't mention it. Julian likes it." Leonard turned back to his plate. It was the most dismissive sound a human being could make without words. The woman across the table hid her expression behind her wineglass. Someone to Audra's left shifted in their seat. Julian, to his credit, put his hand over Celia's on the table. "She looks beautiful," he said. Leonard glanced at his son. Something moved across his face, not disapproval exactly, more the look of a man watching someone else make a mistake and deciding not to intervene. "Your mother called today," Leonard said to Julian, as if Celia hadn't been mentioned at all. The conversation moved on. Audra watched Celia's shoulders hold very still through 3 more courses. The trouble began during dessert. One of the club stewards, young, maybe 22, in a short white jacket, was clearing the plates from Audra's end of the table when he caught the edge of Constance Hatch's champagne flute with his tray. The glass tipped. A thin arc of champagne caught the tablecloth and the sleeve of Constance's dress. The young man went white. "I'm so sorry, ma'am. I'm so sorry. I'll get someone to replace this cloth immediately," Leonard said. His voice had not risen. It had instead gone flat and precise in the way that was somehow worse than yelling. "And bring my wife a fresh glass. And find your supervisor." "Yes, sir. I'm so sorry. I didn't ask for commentary." The steward's mouth closed. He moved away quickly with the careful control of someone who knew he was being watched. Constance touched her husband's arm. "Leonard, it was an accident. It was incompetence," Leonard said. "Not loudly, just certainly. There's a difference." Audra had put down her fork. She was looking at Leonard with an expression so neutral it might have been mistaken for boredom. It was not boredom, Leonard noticed. He turned to look at her. "Something on your mind?" he asked. "Just listening," Audra said. "Is that right?" He smiled, and it didn't quite reach his eyes. "It must be nice to have time to sit and listen. Some of us have actual businesses to run." "I imagine it's a lot of work," Audra said pleasantly. "It is." He picked up his fork again. "The kind of work that requires the right connection, the right rooms. Some people understand that instinctively. Others," he let the pause sit just long enough to be deliberate, "spend their whole lives working on it." "Some do," Audra agreed. Celia's hand was very still on the tablecloth. Julian was looking at his father with a look Audra had seen on his face at the engagement dinner, the look of someone watching a thing happen, that they have been unable to stop for their entire life. Leonard wasn't finished. He had an audience and a glass of good wine and the particular momentum of a man who had never learned that there are rooms where you should be quiet. "I'll be honest," he said to the table more than to Audra. "I wasn't sure about this match from the beginning. Julian is a Hatch. That name means something in this city, came with responsibilities attached." He gestured vaguely. "A man in his position needs a partner who understands the terrain, the social architecture, someone who knows how to." He paused and glanced at Celia. "Show up correctly." The table had gone quiet. "She showed up for me," Julian said. "You're 27, Leonard said dismissively, as if age settled it. "And that makes me wrong?" "It makes you inexperienced." Leonard set down his wine. "Which is fine, we all start there. But decisions made at 27 have to be lived with at 57, and I've lived long enough to know the difference between love and good judgment." He said it as if they were opposite things. Julian's jaw tightened. Celia was looking at her plate. The woman across the table had found something extremely interesting in the middle distance. Audra folded her napkin and placed it on the table. "I'm curious," she said, and her voice was calm in a way that made several people at the table look up. "When you say show up correctly, what do you mean exactly?" Leonard turned to her with the expression of a man who had expected to be agreed with. "I mean presence, background, an understanding of how things work in the world that matters." "The world that matters," Audra repeated. "The one we're in right now." He gestured around at the room. "The crystal, the mahogany, the people who had been coming here for generations. Celia's a nice girl. I'm sure she means well. But she grew up in—" He paused and looked at Audra. "Different circumstances. She grew up in a house with a lot of books and a mother who worked long hours," Audra said. "You're right about that. That's not a criticism." "I know it isn't," Audra said. "It's a measurement." Leonard blinked. "You're measuring her," Audra said, still pleasantly, "against a standard you set in a room you own, using criteria that you've decided matter. And you're finding her lacking, not because she's done anything wrong, but because her shoes aren't the right brand, and her mother came in a blazer." "I didn't say anything about shoes." "You thought it," Audra said. The table was very quiet now. Even the silverware seemed to be holding still. Leonard set down his glass. "I think," he said slowly, "that you may not fully understand the kind of people who are in this room tonight." "I've been a member here for 11 years, Audra said. "I understand the room. Then you understand that reputation is currency in a place like this. And, Mr. Hatch." Audra's voice had not changed, not in tone or volume, but something in it had shifted. The quality of it, the weight. It was the voice she used in her courtroom when someone tried her patience a sentence too long. "I've let this conversation run because I wanted to see where it went. I've seen enough." Leonard stared at her. "My daughter married your son because she loves him. She came to every dinner in this house for 8 months, and she brought hostess gifts, and she learned the names of your staff, and she never once asked to be treated as anything more than part of the family. She asked only to be seen." Audra's eyes did not leave Leonard's face. "You have never once tried. Now wait just a—" "I'm not finished," she said it quietly. "I sat in the gallery at your deposition last spring, the Meridian rezoning case. I read the transcript. I know what the district attorney is looking into, and I know that the commissioner you were discussing at dinner tonight, Commissioner Rafferty, is 3 weeks from a federal indictment on bribery charges related to exactly the project you were describing." The blood moved out of Leonard's face. "I don't know what you think you—" "I think," Audra said, "that you should know what kind of rooms you're actually sitting in before you start measuring the people in them. Because this room includes me, and you don't know who I am." A man down the table, 50s gray suit, the look of someone who spent a lot of time in courthouses, had put down his fork and was staring at Audra with an expression of dawning recognition. "Excuse me," the man said carefully. "Are you— I'm sorry, is your name Voss? Judge Audra Voss?" The table turned. Leonard turned. "Of the Fourth Circuit?" the man said. "The Kellerman opinion?" "You wrote the Kellerman opinion." Constance Hatch, who had been quiet for 15 minutes, made a sound too small to be called a gasp. Audra turned to the man in the gray suit. "Raymond you argued before me in 2019. The Harwick matter. You remembered," Raymond said. "I remember everyone who argues well." She turned back to her plate and picked up her fork. "Mr. Harwick had a good outcome. The silence that followed had a different quality than the one before it. The first silence had been the silence of people watching a scene. This was the silence of people recalibrating. Leonard Hatch was sitting very still. His face had gone from red to gray in the space of 3 minutes. His wineglass was still in his hand, untouched, as if he had forgotten he was holding it. "You're a federal judge," he said. "Not an accusation, not a question. Something else, the sound a man makes when the floor shifts under him and he's not sure yet if it will hold." "Chief Judge," Audra said. "Of the Fourth Circuit, yes. Since 2018, I didn't," Leonard started and then stopped, because there was nothing to say that didn't make it worse, and he was just smart enough to know it. "No," Audra said. "You didn't." Julian was looking at his mother-in-law with an expression that had moved past surprise into something quieter and more complicated. Respect, maybe. Or the particular feeling you get when you realize someone you underestimated has been protecting you this whole time without saying a word. Celia was looking at her mother the way she'd looked at her since she was 7 years old, like she was the still point in a moving room. "I'd like to tell you a story," Audra said to Leonard. Her voice had come back to its dinner-table register, calm and unhurried. 7 months before Julian and Celia's wedding, I sat in this building in the third-floor reading room, and I read every public filing associated with your company's development portfolio. Not because I was looking for something, because I like to know the rooms I sit in." Leonard said nothing. "In that portfolio I found 3 transactions that referenced Commissioner Rafferty's office in language that a careful reader would find interesting. I did not act on it. It was not my matter, but I noted it, the way judges note things." She looked at him levelly. "That was before the wedding, before the engagement dinner, before you told your son at the table in your home, in front of my daughter, that he was making a mistake by marrying someone without the right background." Raymond Cho, down the table, had the discreet, careful expression of a man storing everything he was hearing into a very safe mental compartment. "My daughter said nothing," Audra continued. "She came home and she cried, and she decided to try harder. She wrote your wife a thank-you note the next morning. She called your assistant to ask about your schedule so she could plan around family events. She spent 8 months in the margins of your world, trying to earn something that should have been given to her the day she made your son happy." Leonard's jaw had tightened, but he was not speaking. Something in the air around him had changed, the particular stillness of a man who has realized, too late, that he has been making an enormous error in a room where errors have consequences. "What do you want?" he said. Not quite a question. "I want you to look at your son," Audra said. Leonard turned to Julian. Julian met his father's eyes. He did not look angry. He looked tired in the way you look tired when something has been going on for a very long time and you've been hoping it would stop on its own. "She's my wife, Julius. She's not a candidate. She's not on probation. She's my wife, and she deserves to be treated like a member of this family, not like someone auditioning for it." Leonard was quiet for a long moment. The table waited. Constance reached over and put her hand on her husband's. "He's right," she said softly. It was the first thing she had said in 20 minutes, and the simplicity of it seemed to cost her nothing, which meant it had been waiting a long time to be said. Leonard looked at his wife, then at his son, then, finally, at Celia, who was looking at him with the expression of someone who had hoped for a long time, and was now simply waiting to see if the hoping had been worth anything. "I owe you an apology," Leonard said. He said it to Celia, and he said it slowly, like a man who had not used those particular words in that order very often. "More than one, if I'm honest about it." Celia held his gaze. "Yes," she said, "you do. It was not forgiveness. It wasn't supposed to be. Not yet. Not in a single sentence at a dinner table. But it was a beginning, and Celia had learned from her mother how to tell the difference between something real and something performed. This was real. She could hear it. Julian exhaled. Under the table, Audra folded her napkin precisely in half and then in half again. Raymond Cho refilled his water glass and said nothing, which was the wisest thing anyone in the room did all evening. The dinner ended as dinners do. Plates cleared, coats retrieved, cars brought around. The club's front steps emptied slowly in the cold October air, couples moving toward waiting sedans, valets working fast to keep from being kept. Audra found the young steward from dinner near the coat check. He was off his shift, jacket in hand, looking like he was trying very hard to be invisible. "Hey," she said. He looked up. braced himself. "You did fine in there," she said. "Accidents happen. Don't let someone else's reaction become the version of the night you remember." He looked at her for a moment, then nodded. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "Thank you." She walked out to where the 19-year-old valet was bringing her car around. "Any trouble with it?" she asked. "No, ma'am. It runs real smooth for a 10-year-old car." "I know," she said. "I bought it new." She tipped him again and got in and drove away from the Whitmore Club down the avenue of live oaks that lined the approach to the harbor, and the night settled around her car like it always did. Quiet, unhurried, belonging to no one. Across town in a different parking lot, Leonard Hatch sat in the back of his car and said nothing for several minutes. His driver, a man named Sullivan who had worked for him for 9 years, did not ask what was wrong. He had learned over 9 years that some nights were like this. Leonard coming out of events smaller than he'd gone in. The air in the car different, like pressure had changed somewhere. "Sullivan," Leonard said finally. "Sir, do you know what a Fourth Circuit Chief Judge is?" Sullivan considered. "Something to do with the federal courts, I'd imagine. It's the second highest federal court in the country," Leonard said. "Below the Supreme Court." Sullivan said nothing. "She's been sitting at my dinner table for 8 months, Leonard said. He was talking to the window. "She brought wine. She asked about my knee surgery. She complimented Constance on the centerpieces." He paused. "She knows everything about the Rafferty business, and she never said a word." Sullivan kept his eyes on the road. "She could have," Leonard said. "She had every reason to, and she just sat there and watched." The car moved through the empty streets. A light changed. The harbor went dark and glittering past Leonard's window. "Why didn't she?" Sullivan said. Leonard thought about that for a long time. "Because she didn't need to," he said finally. "That's the part I don't understand. She didn't need anything from me." He turned away from the window. "Constance is right," he said. "I've been a fool." Sullivan did not agree or disagree. He drove. The weeks that followed were not a fairy tale. Leonard Hatch did not transform overnight into a different man. That is not how men like Leonard work, and to pretend otherwise would be an insult to everyone who has ever been on the receiving end of someone like him. Change came slowly, the way it does when it comes at all. One meal, one phone call, one moment of choosing differently than before. He called Celia 2 days after the dinner. He did not make a speech. He said he'd been thinking, and that he had been wrong about several things, and that he hoped she would give him the chance to be less wrong going forward. Celia said she would think about it. That was honest, and Leonard had the grace not to push for more. 3 weeks after the dinner, the federal indictment dropped. Commissioner Rafferty was charged with 11 counts of bribery and wire fraud. Leonard Hatch's name appeared in the early filings as a peripheral figure, someone who had made inquiries, not actions. His lawyers said he had nothing to worry about. Audra, when she saw the filing, noted it the way she always did. She said nothing to Leonard. She did not need to. He understood by then what silence from a woman like her meant, and what it cost her to maintain it. Julian and Celia bought a house in the spring, not in the Hatch family's neighborhood, in a quieter part of the city, close to the harbor, with a yard and a kitchen with good light. Leonard came to see it in May, uninvited but called ahead. He walked through every room and said it was beautiful, which it was. He said he was proud of them, which he meant. Constance came back the following week and brought flowers and a casserole dish and stayed for 3 hours talking with Celia about things that had nothing to do with social architecture or the right rooms. They laughed twice. It was a start. Audra came to the housewarming and brought wine, the same kind she always brought, and sat on the back porch in the evening light and listened to the harbor and said very little. Julian sat down beside her at one point and they watched the water together. "Did you know," he asked, "at the beginning, who he was, what he was like?" "I had a sense," she said, "and you let it go on." "I waited," she said. "There's a difference." "For what?" "For him to be exactly who he was, in front of enough people that there was no arguing with it." She looked at the water. "I've spent 30 years waiting for the right moment. You learn that it always comes if you're patient." Julian thought about that. "Celia does the same thing," he said. "I know," Audra said. "I taught her." She refilled his glass and went back inside to find her daughter. "There is a particular kind of strength that looks like nothing at all, that walks into rooms in plain shoes and asks how everyone is doing and listens to the answer. That absorbs insults the way stone absorbs rain, not because it has to, but because it is old enough and still enough to know the rain will stop and the stone will remain. Audra Voss had that. She had built it the way you build anything worth having, slowly, over a long time, with attention and without shortcuts. She had also built it, in part, for Celia, so that her daughter would know what it looked like, so that Celia would know, when she walked into rooms that tried to measure her, that being measured didn't mean being small. That was the real inheritance. Not money, not a name, not a seat at any particular table. Just the knowledge that the quiet ones are often the ones holding the door. Now, I want to ask you something, and I want you to be honest. If you had been at that dinner table, before anyone said the word judge, before Raymond Cho spoke up, before Leonard's face went gray, would you have said anything? Would you have looked at a woman in a 10-year-old blazer and flat shoes and seen what was actually there? Or would you have done what Leonard did? Think about that, and then drop your answer in the comments, because I genuinely want to know. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs it. Like it so more people find it. And subscribe to Velvet Verdict, because we are just getting started, and the next story is already waiting. The richest person in the room is almost never the one making the most noise. Usually, they're the one who already knows every name and doesn't need anyone to know theirs.